Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a nice little 4-game slate for college basketball. The slate starts at 7 o'clock. These games are a little bit staggered, so we're going to basically see one or two of these games at a time, with the exception at the start, the first two games in the first hour, but then we have the 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock game. All four of these games are relatively tight when it comes to the spreads. They're all about somewhere between 4 and 9 points, and then the total points for each game are anywhere from 131 to 145, so not a whole lot of difference there. A little bit of a difference, obviously, but overall, there's some really solid plays available here, and a good enough amount of value that I think we can make a pretty good lineup. So I've got 6 guards and 4 forwards. I think it's a little bit guard heavy, just when it comes to the quality of guards available, but overall, it's a pretty decent slate. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now, there's not a ton of guys that are super expensive today. There's no $10,000 players or anything like that. So we just have some $8,000 guys to start off with here. Now, I don't necessarily think that it's going to be all that wise to put a whole bunch of $8,000 players in, because it's going to be hard to fit them, but there's a couple that are worth taking a look at anyway. And the first one will be Jalen House for New Mexico. He looks pretty decent today. He does look a little bit overpriced, but on a 4-game slate, you're gonna have to deal with that a little bit more. And if you want to pay over $8,000 for a guard, he or Colby Jones will probably be your best bets. He does get a lot of steals, which definitely could limit his fantasy points if he doesn't get them. But when he does get them, he tends to pay off a lot. He also has the highest upside of any guard that we have on this slate. And so I do think he's viable, but he's a little bit risky. Then we're going to look at Colby Jones, who I mentioned, at Xavier. He's around the same price as him. He's also a bit overpriced, but he is a little bit more, he is pretty consistent, scoring over 30 fantasy points in all those games since December 28th, except for one. And so I think he has a viability here that's really good. And I should say that's 29 points, not 30, that he's been over since the beginning of the year. But overall, he's played really solid for Xavier, and I think he's in a pretty good spot. Now, he's not quite as good as I'd like him to be when it comes to the price, but overall, I think he's viable here. Then I'm going to mention Sully Boom for Xavier as well. He's in a very similar spot to Colby Jones. He's got a very similar price. He's got just about the same consistency and a little bit of a higher floor than Colby Jones does, but he hasn't been quite as good consistently as Jones, but I still think he's viable here. So all three of those guys being over $8,000 are probably your best bets for $8,000 plus guards. Then I have 3 more guards that are a little bit cheaper here, and we're going to start with Jamal Mashburn Jr. for New Mexico. He's looks like a really good play today, though he is a little bit scoring dependent, so you do have to keep an eye on that because he doesn't tend to get a ton of peripheral stats. His assists and rebounds are not that high for a guy that plays as many minutes as he does. But he is in a faster place game here, and his team is projected to win, and I expect him to have a pretty solid game here. He's played really well this season. In fact, he had 31 fantasy points against Air Force the first time he played them, and he's been taking a lot of shots, and he's definitely going to be a volume shooter, so I do think he's very viable on the slate. In 3 games versus Air Force in his career, the last 2, he's been over 31 fantasy points in each. So I think he's a great option on the slate. He's going to be somebody that I think will be in my lineup today for certain. Then we're going to look at Isaiah Hill for Fresno. Now, he has played really well as of late. His minutes are there in the mid-30s, and while he started the season off pretty slow, he's really been improved fantasy-wise as the season has gone along. And he has nice upside. He's almost got as much upside as Jamal Mashburn does, despite him himself being almost $900 cheaper. And even though Fresno's not slated to win the game, they've been playing really well, even when they lose. And so I expect him to play well in this one. Jermero Baker, also for Fresno State. He's my last guard, and he's pretty cheap at $5,600. He's been a really solid starter for most of the season. He has decent upside. He's been playing really well as of late. Now, his floor isn't as high as his upside is not as high as, some of the other guys, but obviously he's a little bit cheaper. But he has a good floor, and he's got a pretty good average lately. He's been averaging around 20 fantasy points a game for the most part, though he's had a couple off games lately, but he's been solid, and I think he's in a good spot here in in a game that, while it is the lower scoring game on the slate, he and Hill have been the two best players for Fresno as of late. And then we're going to look at our forwards here, and we're going to start with um, Kamara for Dayton. He's my favorite expensive player on the slate today, $200. He's probably my favorite guy overall on the slate as it is, and he's a guy that I think is a must play along with Jamal Mashburn, I should say. I meant to put him in here. Excuse me. For Dayton, he has a massive ceiling here, and he has a decent floor as well. He's played really well as of late. He does have double-double potential too, which he's been increasingly getting lately. And he plays a lot of minutes, so he has great upside. And he's got a nice matchup here against St. Louis, where it should be a relatively tight game, so he should play a full complement of minutes. And his upside is the highest on the slate at 50-ish plus upside. So he's probably my favorite play just in general on the slate overall. Then we're going to look at Udeze for New Mexico. He has played really well this season as well. He's been playing really well as late. He might be my favorite play on the slate just because of his upside and his price being so much cheaper than some of the other options. He's scored 29 fantasy points or more in all but one game since in this 2023. So he has some really good upside. I think he's a great play, in fact, and so he's definitely somebody that I think should help fill out the lineup. He doesn't have the upside that Kamara has, obviously, but he does have some good upside just the same, and he's been really consistent. So definitely makes me like him quite a bit. And then we're going to look at Eduardo Andre for Fresno State. Now, he's been a lot less consistent than some of the other options here, but he has more upside than just about anybody at this in these price range on the slate. He's got 35 fantasy point upside. He's had some really big games, and he plays a lot of minutes most of the time, but he does get hampered by fouls, and that's really what the risk with him is, because he does get into foul trouble sometimes and plays only 10 to 15 minutes, and when that happens, that's a tough thing to do. In the last 7 games, he's had 3 of them where he's been under 14 fantasy points in 19 minutes played. As a result, it looks like due to fouls. So keep that in mind. But he is viable on the slate. He's not a must-play, obviously, because of that foul situation, but he does have nice upside. So he is somebody to consider. And then finally, last but not least, Jake Forrester for St. Louis. Now, his team is in a better scoring game than Fresno is, and he's been playing pretty solid this season. He's pretty cheap, which is nice, and he does come off the bench, and he also plays somewhat limited minutes sometimes. That's a little bit of issue, but he doesn't have to score much here to really pay off, and he does have nice upside as a result of his price. When he does get more than 15 minutes, which happens most of the time, he tends to score pretty well in the fantasy perspective. He does get some rebounds and some assists and blocks, which definitely boosts his fantasy output as well. So he is somebody to consider here. A little bit risky because he has a really low floor, but again, when you're paying $3,600 for a guy, you're not too worried about his floor so much. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day.